Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is LaQuantia Goodman, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. As time allows, we will also allow folks to unmute themselves to ask questions live. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESGCV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the question and answer session. Next slide. Office hours recordings and a copy of the slide deck will be emailed to you within 1 week. Next slide. Our agenda for today's session includes ESG updates and resources, ESGCV updates, office hour updates, ESG and ESGCV question and answer, and today's spotlight session, Continuum of Care 101. Next slide. I'll now turn it over to Anthony for our ESG updates.
Good morning, everyone. Just a few reminders today. You can see on the slide that we are taking suggestions for development of our state ESG guidelines. If you didn't have a chance to make a contribution during our outreach sessions, please shoot us an email at the address listed on the slide. Next slide, please. Let's see, I still show the same slide, so I can be a little slower. There we go. So those are just dramatic pauses for everyone when I do that. So just to make you very excited for the next slide. And a reminder that the 2022 ESG Award announcements are still in progress. We're going through those one by one, week by week with our legal and contract teams. The good news is CoC awards for the 2023 ESG Annual NOFA are on the ESG website, and we will have the balance of state awards on the site by early January. Next slide, please. And just my weekly plug here to check out the ESG webpage on our policy documents page. Just a wealth of information and guidance. Some really helpful stuff. Believe it or not, the ESG team gets on there all the time and looks at those documents because they are excellent work, and we appreciate all the work that ICF has done for us to put those together. Next slide, please. Diane, Sam, Tuesday, myself, and Giovanni. And with that, I will turn it over to LaQuantia.
Thank you, Anthony. Now for our ESGCV updates and reminders. Reminders for performance milestones. We know that we have met our expenditure deadlines for all of our components as well as our admin and HMIS. But reallocated funds, we still have some deadlines approaching for those. And remember that our contracts, or most of our contracts, are ending on December 31st. And those reallocated funds contracts all end June 30th, 2024. Next slide. As we've mentioned before and have been doing weekly now, our office hours are weekly again, and recordings and the slide decks are emailed to you within a week. Our upcoming topics include on December 20th, Equity 102, and our next office hours after December 20th will be on January 10th with Homeless and Housing Resource Center and SOAR and PATH. Next slide. Are we seeing any questions in the chat at this time? I don't see any. Next slide, please. If you have any questions later today or at any time, please feel free to reach out to your annual ESG rep or reach out to them at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov, or you can reach out to your ESG CV grant administrator. Next slide. And we'll now turn it over to Chris and Mike for Continuum of Care 101.
Thanks, LaQuantia, and thank you all for being with us today. We are going to cover Continuum of Care 101. We get a lot of questions about Continuum of Care, and as it relates to the ESG office hours, it's a really good reminder for us to just go into it every once in a while. So I will introduce myself, Chris Pitcher from ICF, he, him, his pronouns, and I identify as white. I'll be taking the first part of this section. Michael Thomas, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so I'm Michael Thomas. I use he, him pronouns. Also with ICF. Happy to be here today. Thanks.
All right. So we will move right into it. So we're going to talk about the history and structure of the CoC program. I'm going to be pretty general and broad. If you have questions, please just ask them at the end. We'll have time to go through those. And then Michael Thomas is going to talk us through some project types at the second half of the session today. So again, I'm going to talk about the history and structure of the Continuum of Care program, and it is quite a history. It is a big program for funding federal homelessness. When you look at our ESG program, small in comparison. The CoC program is a combination of several old legacy programs and has turned into the largest funding competition for homeless service funding in the country. You see here we have funding for runaway and homeless youth all the way at the bottom, emergency shelter food program, ESFP, annual ESG, then supportive service of veterans and their families, the VA program, and then all follow in comparison to the CoC program. Obviously, what you don't see on the slide is ESG CV, which was big at $4 million, but that was a stimulus program. We didn't want to put that in here to show annually, but that was a very large program as well. So again, a lot more funding in CoC than ESG. So a lot of times the Continuum of Care program takes the front and ESG is kind of a follower. That has not been our messaging in these because this is ESG and ESG CV office hours, but CoC program is much larger and gets much more attention. So just going back in history a little bit. So back in the early 90s to mid 90s, the CoC planning process was developed to help coordinate and distribute multiple homeless service programs. There were a bunch of different legacy programs, and this planning process was meant to coordinate them. The guidelines for the programs were laid out in each year's notice of funding availability, and there were often significant changes from year to year. Back in 2009, for those of us that were around, the Hearth Act was passed, and that gave congressional authorization to the CoC program, formalized a lot of the coordination of those multiple funding sources, brought them together, also created the modern ESG program. So ESG used to be the Emergency Shelter Grants program. It's now the Emergency Solutions Grants program, and brought us the hearth homeless definitions that we all use for eligibility moving forward. The CoC interim rule was created in 2012. It is still interim. That's a long time to be interim. And that codifies the structure of the CoC program, introduces the idea of a CoC board, tells us what the CoC is, the projects that it can do. And it does begin to limit the ability to make rules in CoC, notice of funding availabilities or notice of funding opportunities, which they are now called NOFOs. Mike's probably going to hit this a little bit, that we still do a little rulemaking in the NOFOs annually, but it is not the sweeping changes that it used to be in the 90s or even prior to the Hearth Act. It's much more nuanced and not so broad. So we'll just focus on the planning process a little bit more. That was developed again to help coordinate and distribute all these different funding programs. That is something that the Hearth Act took care of and consolidated. We had programs like SHP, Shelter Plus Care. Those are not words we use anymore, but they were distinct projects and programs in the past. It was intended to address two problems that still exist. There being little incentive to cooperate between programs. This is something that plagued us for quite some time, not being able to cooperate and collaborate between programs. So we have done well to get away from our problems from the 90s, but there still is some coordination and collaboration that has to happen. And we've gone from cooperating and coordinating through programs to actually cooperating and coordinating through federal partners. The CoC program coordinates with the VA, coordinates with SAMHSA and other projects. We've made quite a bit of progress on planning since then. It was also intended the submission and review of applications across multiple programs was burdensome for everybody, for HUD, for the communities. So it was meant to kind of narrow that down a little bit. And then the guidelines for the CoC planning process were included in each NOFA, and they changed a lot. So we really wanted to take care of that with the Hearth Act. The Hearth Act reauthorized the McKinney-Vento program. You might call it McKinney-Vento. And the Continuum of Care program was created out of that consolidated a lot of those programs, Shelter Plus Care, SHP, a few others, into a single program, which is a little bit easier to manage for all of us. Those programs that were all combined together, the Home Assistance Program, now make up the largest grants program to address homelessness in the federal government. $2.65 billion in 2021. It gets a little bit bigger each year, usually. And I said, the Hearth Act created the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, which we have now seen turn into the Emergency Solutions Grant CV program to address coronavirus, but modernized that program, brought things in like rapid rehousing, and changed the name from Shelter Grant to Solutions, noting that our focus on shelter alone was not ending homelessness. We needed other tools at our disposal, primarily rapid rehousing being the largest of those that we focused on. Interim rule in 2012, published, you can see it here, 24 CFR Part 576, serves the same purpose as the ESG program interim rule, and really tells us what is eligible under the CoC program, and lays out what those projects should look like. Mike's going to talk about that in more detail, so I'm not going to focus too much on that, but the interim rule is still very important. So rulemaking. Historically, HUD engaged in lots and lots of changes regularly, making the NOFA process not very consistent year to year. Best practices still weren't really sure. We didn't have the data or understanding nationally that we have now, and we didn't have any congressional authority before the Hearth Act existed in the CoC program interim rule. Today, we have significantly less rules being made from NOFO to NOFO or NOFA to NOFA. It still happens. We see things like housing first or low barrier or housing problem solving being put in, things like that. That just brings us all along in the journey of our knowledge of how homeless services work. And then we also have the ability to make rules. So the rules like the equal access rule, which we've done several sessions on, and we'll actually do a little bit on next week as well. We're going to do equity 102. So we'll talk a little bit about the racial equity, equal access rule. But making rules is important as well, and not doing so through NOFO or NOFA process. The upside of this is it's relatively quick and we can be responsive in our rulemaking. The downside is projects are sometimes bound by the original or most recent NOFO interim rules or other policies. So it's not as easy as saying, all programs follow this rule. Well, your NOFO might have a slightly different rule that we have to be able to track. And we do a lot of policy nuance setting through the Ask a Question or AAQ process, which doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has the same information. The asker got the answer, but doesn't mean everyone else got that answer. So that is a slight downside, but it does allow us to answer questions a little bit quicker than we had in the past. And I don't know why that went backwards, but we'll go back forwards. So I'll talk a little bit about the elements of a CoC, and they're not all here, but I'll hit most of them. So what is a CoC? That's the biggest question I get. What is it? Well, it depends, but it's the entire coalition of agencies, individual people working to prevent end homelessness in your community. That is affected by what your community is. Is it a state? Is it a county? Is it several counties? And who your coalitions are. We don't all have the same partners. Some of us have partners that are different because we just don't have that in our community. This affects smaller communities more. So a CoC looks different from community to community, but generally speaking, anyone who is looking to prevent or end homelessness is part of the CoC, whether they know it or not. One of the major elements of the CoC is the collaborative applicant. In the past, we would call this the CoC lead. This is the agency that is responsible for submitting the annual applications to the CoC program. Also generally coordinates meetings. It's the administrative body of the CoC. They do have, in some communities, an outsized role that we'll talk about through the governance piece of this. But a cloud advocate is something that the CoC chooses and can choose anytime. If a cloud advocate isn't working out, we can always find another one, that kind of stuff. So very important functionality, the backbone administrative entity of the CoC. The other entity that is often noted is the HMIS lead agency, and this is the agency that's responsible for operating and overseeing the CoC's HMIS. Again, responsible, just like the cloud applicant, to the CoC, usually through the CoC board, which you do not see on this list that I'll talk about in more detail when we get to governance. HMIS lead agency is oftentimes running reports and making sure folks are getting trained in HMIS, and ultimately have responsibility to the CoC and the CoC board. So if there needs to be a change in HMIS leadership, that's how that would happen. All this is tied together by governance. These are boards and committees that are actually making the decisions. So the cloud applicant itself can't always do everything. We need to have a set of committees or set of group of folks that are wrapping around the cloud applicant, the CoC structure, the HMIS lead. We usually have a data committee or some sort to actually govern how the CoC operates. And that will look very different from community to community, depending on how or who your cloud applicant is, how your CoC operates. And there are 44 CoCs in the state of California. There are a lot of similarities, but there are also a lot of nuances in how all of this ties together. But through the creation of the CoC interim rule, we know that the CoC board is the ultimate responsibility of governance. How you dictate or give authority to other entities, whether that's work groups or committees, is all really up to you as far as HUD is concerned. The important thing about a CoC, it is a collaboration. It's a big group of people. We have folks that are in the mental health field, domestic violence, youth, all these folks together, all working to end homelessness in our own very way. But it's important to note that the cloud applicant is not the same as the CoC. The CoC is everybody. The cloud applicant is generally an entity, and oftentimes they might have a lot of leadership. And we must always remember that the cloud applicant is selected by the board, and committees wrap around the cloud applicant. So this is not, this is not a bad thing. Cloud applicants do great work, but we often see them having an outsized role, and that's natural given all the coordination and administrative stuff that happens at that place. But the CoC board is ultimately responsible, and committees help the board to get along. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of the structure. We have the CoC program. The CoC program funds projects, allows the CoCs to operate. And under the CoCs, you often have opportunities for new projects. Many of us are in renewal projects at this point. We might have special initiatives like YHTP or the Unsheltered Initiative could also be there with a big asterisk. Are the type of projects you would have. Under the CoC, we have the cloud applicant, HMIS lead, the governance structure, the CoC board, all those committees and all that structure that support it. And I don't know why I keep going backwards. I'm sorry, folks. So funding as an incentive for the structure. HUD offers projects funding, but only CoCs can apply. We've taken this same rule and applied it to ESG funds in the state of California as well. You need to be part of a CoC to apply for ESG funding. It really assures the coordination, and that is a piece that we're not going to talk about too much today, but the coordination between ESG and CoC is in each program's rules. We must work together. These are complementary programs. Communities form their own CoC. They determine if it's a county, if it's a multi-county, if it's statewide, and then annually, they should be looking at the cloud applicant and choosing them. We don't usually choose them annually. We usually choose them once and make sure they're doing a good job. Every once in a while, we have to change cloud applicants due to many different factors that can happen. The cloud applicant leads the effort to apply for funding. They're doing the one big piece of the application. Projects are doing another big piece, and then they're in charge of getting the whole thing submitted, typically through eSnaps, though eSnaps only came about in modern days. In the past, it was actually doing it all on paper. I've been around that long. But the cloud applicant, or what we used to call the CoC lead, does that application funding. That is one of the big administrative tasks that is asked of them. CoC funding requires coordination. Coordination across the CoC, coordination with other programs like the ESG program is required. Others are just necessary. We need to work with the VA. We need to work with the Mental Health Authority. We need to work with all these other entities, or we can't holistically address homelessness if we just try to do it in a silo. And then CoCs develop their governance structure. What does this look like? So the CoC board is the ultimate decision maker. The CoC body might have roles. This cloud applicant has things to do. So does the HMIS lead. We didn't even talk about the CES. Oftentimes we have a CES lead, which might be a little bit different for coordinated entry, but you develop that structure. So that's where a lot of variation and things start to look different. And the cycle of funding goes back, NOFA starts, and we go again. And it just kind of keeps going annually, year after year. And in recent times, we've had a lot of initiative-based applications as well. YHTP, Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, unsheltered homelessness as well. So there is a large amount of money available through the CoC program. However, much of it is wrapped up in renewals annually. There is a high admin cap of 10% and a low match requirement of only quarter percent, 25% rather. For ESG, that's a 1-to-1. It's 100% match, basically. So very different from the ESG program, much larger, more admin, and lower match than ours. CoC tends, not always, but tends to see the funding grow from year to year as new project awards kind of outpace what we lose. ESG stays pretty stable. It does fluctuate from year to year, but it doesn't take big ups or big downs. It's pretty stable. The CoC tends to grow. That's not always going to be the case at some point. Probably that won't be the case, but has been to date. New projects are in competitive processes and complex. Renewals, a little bit easier. Once you put something in the competitive space, you are competing not against yourselves and not against just the state of California. You're competing against every CoC, and how you fund, how you score gives you an understanding of whether you're going to have access to new funding or not. All right, CoC collaborative applicants. We usually will see them have a CoC planning grant. This is annual funding for CoC operations, so the coordination and management of the CoC. It's 3% of the total annual renewal amount. So if your renewal amount rises, your CoC planning grant rises. It doesn't usually rise a whole lot, but that does kind of keep pace at 3%. As I said, that we generally then see the CoC planning grant grow a little bit each year. Every once in a while, they'll make big leaps, but not usually. Usually it's a small grow. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. Sometimes cloud applicants have a little bit of outsized influence over the CoC. We need to make sure that we have a cloud applicant that understands that they're not the CoC. And we've heard that in some communities. But that outsized role is so important, and it's important. It's easy for providers and members of the CoC to cede more power because we've got someone dedicated to it, but that's not necessarily the best thing for your community in every situation. So that's just kind of a high-level CoC overview. I certainly could have done that in 2 hours or 10 minutes. I did the shorter version. There's a lot of pieces to CoCs and questions you might have. Love to have those here at the end after Mike Thomas walks us through the CoC project types. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I will get into a little more detail on some of the project types, and it's going to be pretty high level, even though I just said detail. So just to point out, as an ESG recipient, it's not always critical to understand every single little aspect of this, but it's good to have an overview of how these projects work when they're funded by the CoC. And there's a lot of things that can affect how these projects work too. And I'll talk through this in some of the examples. It sort of filters down from the legislative level down to the local level and the CoC's local written standards. So, if you're collaborating with CoC funded projects, really the best thing to do is work closely with the local CoC so you understand all of those nuances. With all of that being said, let's jump into some of those project details. So what you see on your screen here is basically how this is set up, like what lives under the CoC program. So we've kind of grouped them by category. So you've got common projects that actually serve participants. That's typically going to be permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, joint rapid rehousing and transitional housing projects, and supportive services only projects. That are for coordinated entry. That one actually kind of straddles the line between participant serving and structural. And sometimes it's a little more of one, sometimes it's a little more of the other, but we had to put it somewhere. So we put it under participant serving here. Then we have the structural programs. Those are the ones that support the things that the CoC has to do to be compliant and to operate the continuum of care, but they don't directly serve participants. That's going to be your planning grant that Chris mentioned. And there's also funding for HMIS, Homeless Management Information Systems, available through the CoC program. And then finally, we'll talk through some of the unusual and like legacy programs. These are the ones that you can't really get new funding for through the CoC anymore, but they do still exist as legacy programs. So that's primarily supportive services only programs and transitional housing. And then your demo projects. So those are demonstration projects. Those are the ones that are a little more unusual. So like the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program is a good example. It's unusual because it technically stands alone as a new project. It's not applied for through the usual CoC process. It's a totally separate application. But then when those projects renew, they do renew through the CoC process. They go through, they can either be renewed or replaced, depending on what the CoC is trying to accomplish with that project. So that's just a little illustration of how there are some kind of unusual things that happen through the CoC process as well. Next slide, please. So permanent supportive housing, that is the first participant serving project type we'll talk about here. This is for long-term placement. So it's long-term, there's no maximum length of stay, and it comes with wraparound supportive services. This can be single site or it can be scattered site. So, it's not uncommon to see either of those. Sometimes it's a bunch of units in one building. Sometimes it is, like duplexes, things like that, spread over a larger geography. Sometimes it's a bunch of units in one building over here and a bunch of units in another building over here. So it can be set up in a variety of different ways. So the units, when they're funded with leasing dollars for this, and again, you don't have to understand all of these details in depth, but there are different budget line items, of course. One of those is leasing, the other is rental assistance. And depending on how the project is structured, they might be paying the rent with either of those. If the rent for individual units is being paid with leasing dollars, then those must meet the fair market rent requirements, rent reasonableness requirements, and housing quality standards, which is a different standard than is used with the ESG program. ESG currently uses the minimum habitability standards, although I will note, as of October 1st next year, that all becomes antiquated and everyone will be using what's called the NSPIRE standards. So what I'm telling you right now is current, it will be antiquated soon. So that's just something to be aware of. So anytime you see HQS in here, you can pretty much substitute in NSPIRE as of October 1st next year. And I, in my hasty edit earlier, put unites. That should actually say units. Units funded with rental assistance dollars must meet the rent reasonableness requirements, but they do not have to meet fair market rent requirements. So again, it's a subtle difference, but it's a very important one. Those units would also have to meet housing quality standards. Eligibility for permanent supportive housing, there are a lot of nuances there that I'm not going to go into. I will just say it's one of those things that happens in those layers that I mentioned earlier. So like the CoC program interim rule says what the broad eligibility is. And then when you have the annual NOFO, that NOFO says what the eligibility is that year. And there have been some significant changes to that. The one that I'm thinking of specifically for permanent supportive housing is the addition of dedicated plus. That happened several years ago, but it's a relatively new change and a pretty significant one. So all that to say, there are a lot of things that can determine eligibility here. But in general, beds in these projects would be dedicated to households that meet the chronic homeless definition. new projects would be required in recent NOFOs to be dedicated to chronic homeless or to be the next thing on the list, dedicated plus. So that's the other thing you would see. Dedicated Plus is still prioritized to chronically homeless, but it also gives the ability to be a little more flexible and serve other populations as well. Notably, the project has to be open to serving families under Dedicated Plus. So that's an important thing to note there. And then you also see some projects for permanent supportive housing that are not dedicated beds. Those are usually going to be projects that have been in existence for some amount of time, and they're just renewing every year, because what is typically allowed in the NOFO is that PSH projects can serve one of the populations specified by the NOFO, or they can continue serving the population that they were originally approved for if they've been in renewal status for a while. So way back when they didn't have to be chronically dedicated, if they're still serving a population defined that way, they can continue doing that, provided that it's consistent with the local CoC's written standards. They still have to prioritize based on how the CoC sets that up. And then also notably for permanent supportive housing, one adult or child member of the household must meet the HUD definition of homeless individual with a disability. So basically, they have to have a severe and persistent disability that is expected to continue. Next slide, please. So rapid rehousing. This is for short or medium term rental assistance and supportive services. So short term is generally up to 3 months, and then medium term would be 3 to 24 months. CoC written standards, again, can set limitations on that that are a little tighter than what I just said. This is what NOFOs have said recently, so we're kind of going by the NOFO standard here. CoCs might be a little more strict. But yeah, short to medium term, those are the same definitions for short and medium term that ESG uses, so you might be familiar with those. It can be single site or scattered site, but more often you're going to see scattered site rapid rehousing, because more often than not, it's going to involve participants, working with the agency to choose the unit based on where they, client choice and all of that good stuff. Housing must meet the rent reasonableness requirement and housing quality standards, but does not have to meet the fair market rent standard. It is interesting that funding for rapid rehousing, when an agency submits that application through the CoC, the funding provided for the rental assistance and rapid rehousing is allocated based on the fair market rent for where the units are, where they say the units will be located. So that's how the funding is provided. But the actual amount paid for rent only has to meet the rent reasonableness requirements. That's something that those agencies have to be aware of, because the actual reasonable rent might be higher than the FMR, in which case they're probably going to serve fewer units than they put in their application, because they're paying more for rent per unit. That is okay. I think the rent reasonableness thing here really gives them more flexibility, which is ultimately a good thing. For those of you who had ESG CV funding, you probably know how good it is to have that flexibility, because the FMR was waived there as well. So this rapid rehousing can serve people who are experiencing literal homelessness. That's category 1 of the definition. In recent years, category 2 has also been allowed here. So it can also serve those who are at imminent risk of homelessness. Category 2, again, subject to the local CoC's prioritization. So they still have to go through coordinated entry, still have to be prioritized. And finally, can serve category 4, which is people fleeing domestic violence. Next slide, please. So we're going to go on a quick sidebar here. Continuum of Care rapid rehousing versus ESG rapid rehousing. They are very, very similar. There are slight differences, but those slight differences they matter. They matter because of the desire to use these to match one another, which we'll talk a little more on that later. But the differences matter. They both provide rental assistance, short and medium term rental assistance, and the same case management and supportive services, with a few differences. There's some nuanced differences, but in general, you're looking at the same type of rental assistance and service provision. However, Continuum of Care rapid rehousing does not require fair market rent. That's something we talked about, only rent reasonableness. And it requires housing quality standards rather than minimum habitability like ESG requires. HQS is, for all intents and purposes, a higher standard. it does not overlap perfectly with the minimum habitability standards. So each rapid rehousing project funded through the CoC it caps enrollment at 24 months at the federal level, right? But participants can go from those projects into another project, including transfers to other rapid rehousing projects. That practice is kind of frowned upon because ultimately you don't want someone in rapid rehousing for super long periods of time. That's not really what the program is designed for. But it's important to note that it's possible, whereas within ESG, the ESG program interim rule says you can only provide 24 months of rental assistance in a 36-month period. So there is a very definite cap there. Again, it's just a way where the programs are kind of similar, but a little bit different. So something to be aware of. Next slide, please. Joint transitional housing, or joint, I don't know which one they always say first, joint rapid rehousing transitional housing projects. So HUD stopped funding new transitional housing many years ago through the CoC program. But then I think there was a realization that there are populations where transitional housing can be helpful. They do some, like there are populations where it's appropriate to have a more intensive intervention. So these provide rapid rehousing and transitional housing in the same project, along with supportive services and case management. In these, participants are limited to 24 months of assistance, and that can be in any proportion between the transitional or rapid rehousing components. And important here is that in these projects, the agency is required to let participants take whatever path they need to take through it. It cannot be mandated. You have to come in as transitional housing. If we say you can, you'll go to rapid rehousing, and then something happens next. That's not allowed. A participant has to be allowed to come in as transitional, move to rapid rehousing if it's appropriate, or they could come in as rapid rehousing. And then if they need more intensive intervention, move to transitional. They could enroll just in transitional housing and then exit the project, or enroll just in rapid rehousing and exit the project. It's based on what that household needs. So that's a requirement. Aside from that, the project has to follow all of the applicable rules for rapid rehousing and transitional housing as they are described in the CoC program interim rule, in the annual NOFO, and in any written standards that the CoC has. These projects are still relatively new. They've been around for a few years now. So they're not like, brand new, but they are still relatively new, and they're fairly complicated. There's a lot of complicated things about them, including how they're set up in HMIS. So that, that's just something that these projects have to struggle with, to be honest. But there are demonstrated use cases that appear to be really useful here. So, two things that we see is people fleeing DV and youth, because, those are two subpopulations where often transitional housing might be an appropriate intervention compared to your traditional rapid rehousing, and this allows for that option. So that's where we see these particularly useful. Next slide, please. So supportive services only, coordinated entry. These grants fund coordinated entry activities. So all elements of coordinated entry without any of the other structure. So we're talking about things like outreach, assessment, and prioritization, but they cannot fund things like emergency shelter. So basically anything that's involved with getting people into the coordinated entry system to be assessed and prioritized and then placed in the correct project. It can fund housing problem solving, case management, but not direct payments. So homeless prevention and diversion, and possibly rapid exit. It fits within the older legacy SSO project type. So, this was kind of designed by HUD as a way to fund coordinated entry within what is allowable under the CoC program interim rules. So they kind of said, hey, we think we can set this up as a supportive services only program. It's a way to get some funding out to help with this coordinated entry requirement. Let's do that. It's not intended to provide long-term case management, but there's no clear line on a length of time that's a cap or anything like that. It's really just based on how the CoC sets the project up. But again, it should be tied to whatever is necessary to facilitate getting people through the coordinated entry process, setting up the coordinated entry process, things directly related to that. It's still relatively new. And, you know, the guidance on it is basically what's coming out in the NOFOs. That's really all that you have at this point. You know, CoCs kind of figure out how to set it up most appropriately. And then they submit AAQs when they need to and get responses that way. So that's kind of how the policy around these is being set today. Next slide, please. Then we have CoC planning grants. So these fund the operations of the continuum of care. So that's all of the coordination that CoCs are required to do, both to be compliant and to be effective and successful. So planning grants do typically serve as a primary source of funding for the staff doing all of those things and other related expenses. However, for most CoCs, the planning grant is not nearly enough to do everything that they need to do, everything that they want to do, and everything that they should be doing. That's important to note. I believe they have increased the percentage very, very recently for how much CoCs get for these. But, you know, disclaimer, Chris and I are both also HUD TA providers. We're not allowed to help with the competition, so we often do not get into the details of the competition very much. So I'd have to verify what I just said. I think they increased it though. But it's still not enough. And there is only one of them for each CoC, and only the collaborative applicant can apply for and hold this grant. And it cannot provide direct participant services. Next slide, please. Homeless Management Information System. So CoCs can apply for this as well through the annual competition. It's important to note that this does not come from a separate pot of money. The CoC planning grant comes from a completely separate pot of money, and it's not submitted as part of the overall ranked set of projects that the collaborative applicant submits to HUD. HMIS grants are. So the CoC has to be strategic about how it pulls that funding from what might be used for services and what it spends on HMIS. So that's just kind of the balancing act that CoCs have to do. But the funding is possible. And when it is there, it funds everything associated with setting up and operating the CoC's Homeless Management Information System. However, like with planning grants, this is often not enough. And that's, you know, a lot of that is related to what I just said. The CoC has to play that balancing act. How much do we want in HMIS and how much do we need to keep in services? And, you know, it's a delicate act. There's typically only one of these per continuum of care, and only the HMIS lead can apply for and hold this grant. I have seen instances where that is not enforced super strictly. However, according to the rules, only the HMIS lead can have this funding. Next slide, please. Supportive services only. So this is one of our unusual or legacy programs. This one will be more of a legacy program. So these fund supportive services without housing attached. That's why it's unusual. Chris mentioned earlier how HUD has really moved to a housing focus, and that's why these were kind of phased out. However, they do still exist as legacy programs that have been around for a while and are still renewing in some CoCs. So again, supportive services without attached housing. It can fund housing problem solving, but because these are legacy programs with older designs, they are probably not funding housing problem solving because that's a more recent development compared to when most of these were conceptualized. There are no new supportive services only projects allowed, again, due to HUD's focus on housing as the solution to homelessness. Next slide, please. Transitional housing. We talked about that a little bit earlier as one of the legacy projects. So funding for that now is really only available as a new project through the joint rapid rehousing transitional housing project. Standalone transitional housing projects are not funded as new projects. There are still some legacy ones renewing through the CoC program in existence out there. They've dwindled over the years, but they do still exist. They provide medium-term housing assistance that can be up to 24 months, along with supportive services and case management. They can be single site or scattered site. Single site is not an uncommon thing to see there, but it could be either. Housing here must meet FMR, fair market rent reasonableness, and housing quality standards. We just said there are no new transitional housing projects. You know, a lot of reasons for that. Another one to point out is that rapid rehousing appears to be, well, it is less expensive and appears to have similar effectiveness in terms of permanent housing placement and retention. So really, you know, the role for transitional housing, again, has shifted to those populations that have a demonstrable need for a more intensive intervention rather than just making that the default for everyone. However, that new transitional housing, rapid rehousing joint component thing recognizes that transitional housing does have that unique place. So that's the way that it appears now. Next slide, please. So demonstration projects and other stuff. There's all kinds of things that have happened through the CoC program in terms of demonstrations, and you can also hear that as experimental. So those are kind of like either one-off things or they're legacy projects that were rolled into another CoC component, things like that. You know, one way to think about this is, so like in the pandemic response, one of the reasons funding went out through the ESG program for that is that it's a formula grant. It does not require a competition. Money can just be pushed out via a formula. And so it was a fast way to push money out. So HUD did that because it allowed them to get the money out quickly. The CoC program, on the other hand, requires a competition. That's a legislative mandate. And so you can't just push money out through the CoC program. It has to go through a competitive process, which is lengthy, and it requires rating and ranking and scoring and all of that good stuff. But the flexibility is that during the competitive process, HUD can try things, right? That's how when we talked about changing things in the annual NOFO, that's a lot more possible with the CoC program because the ESG program, again, it's formula and it's driven by the CoC, or I'm sorry, the ESG program interim rule, which is very specific. And then there's not a competition that allows adjustments. So you do see strange things happen because the CoC gives flexibility to be experimental. The most common thing there is the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program. We talked a little about that earlier, but we have seen other things. For instance, an HMIS capacity building grant. That was a funding stream that went out a few years ago. And then more recently, there was the unsheltered and rural supplementary NOFO. That's another example of something that's a little different that was pushed out through the CoC program. It's important to note that there are stranger things that exist out there. One of the ones that the gentleman who put these slides together noted was a $150,000 grant that funded both organizational level HMIS activities and hotel motel vouchers in the same project, which is really, really weird. But it is a thing that is out there, and it happened through the CoC program. So take that for what it's worth. The bottom line is that the CoC program is often used as a vehicle for renewable homeless services projects that are granted directly to service providers and don't have another obvious bucket of funding. Next slide, please. I am not going to walk you through this entire table, but when these slides go out, you'll see it just shows overlap. Or it shows a matrix between, you know, the different things that you see on the left and which project type, like how they apply under those project types. So yeah, again, not going to walk you through all of it. And if you want to see the complete eligibility information for any of those project types, I would refer back to the previous slides because they're a lot more detailed. This table is a little more on the general side. Next slide, please. Now, this table shows the project overlap between ESG and CoC. So on your left, you've got the ESG projects, and then on the top, you've got CoC projects, the ones that are blacked out. Of course, there is no overlap. For the ones that do overlap, you see a description. This is going to be most important for matching purposes, most likely. So this will let you see where there is overlap. So yeah, not going through it, but please feel free to refer to it when you get the slides. So finally, let's talk about some general guidance on matching. We kind of hinted on towards this when I talked about rapid rehousing earlier. A little more detail on matching CoC and ESG funds against one another. So they are close partners, but they don't usually match each other with a few exceptions. So Homeless Management Information Systems grants is one possible exception there. It is usually a pretty good fit matching ESG HMIS funding, CoC HMIS funding, because the activities that they do are the same. Rapid rehousing is one where it is a potential match, but you have to be very, very careful because the ESG rapid rehousing project setup has to do things that would be eligible under the CoC project if that's how you're doing the matching. We frame this as if the CoC grant was being used to match ESG. If you were trying to do it the other way around, it would be the opposite. Basically, the bottom line is the rapid rehousing that you are trying to provide match for. So if you have a CoC grant for rapid rehousing and you're trying to match it with ESG, the ESG would have to totally fit there, and it's probably not going to. And it's because of the things we talked about earlier, where they just don't fit perfectly. They use different housing quality standards. And then there's the issue where the CoC does not require fair market rent, but ESG rapid rehousing does. So if they are not a perfect fit based on the way that the projects are set up, they can't match one another. It is usually a good idea, in my opinion, to avoid trying to match those two rapid rehousing funding sources. Instead of matching them, you can consider using them as complementary. So if you have funding through both of those sources for rapid rehousing, you can consider instances where you might need to make transfers between them. Or you can just consider how they work together in terms of, like with the CoC funding, you might consider where you are putting people geographically based on the cost of units, because only rent reasonableness is required there, versus if you have a place where cost of units is a little lower, because with ESG, you're going to have to use fair market rent. So I think using them together that way is a wiser decision than trying to match them, just because it will keep you out of compliance trouble in the long run. And I believe we can go to the next slide. That is all that I have.
Thanks, Mike. So that is the presentation for today. We have time for Q&A. Do we have any? I have not been able to keep up with the chat. So
At this time, we do not have any questions in the chat, that is.
we did just get a question. Can CoC planning funds be used for hiring and leveraging consultants?
Would you like me to take that one? So CoC planning grants have several line items that are relatively broad. And then when the CoC applies for funding in those line items, they have to describe what they are going to do within that broad eligible line item. And the short answer is yes, you can pay for consultants with planning grants, as long as that consultant is facilitating one of the things that the CoC has said it is going to do as part of that broad eligible line item. So I'll give an example. The CoC I used to work with used a consultant as part of our point in time count process. We were a very large CoC, and we had to develop a statistical methodology to predict homelessness in the places that were not counted. And we engaged with an expert consultant for that, and we paid for it with our planning grant. So to the extent that it is eligible under what the CoC has said they are going to do with those funds, yes, you can fund consultants.
And I'll just say to augment that, Mike, that a lot of communities in California use their CoC funds to hire someone to help them write the CoC application. We have a few that do hire, this is through the HMIS grant as well, but hire consultants to help them with HMIS because they might not have the staffing they need. So there are some flexibilities in there to hire folks that have a specific skill that you need that really are the backbone of the administrative pieces of the CoC. Thanks, Richmond, for that question. Anything else that folks want to hear from myself, Mike, or LaQuantia? Okay, I think we can wrap. LaQuantia?
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Mike, for CoC 101. If in the future, you do have questions, feel free to reach out to your grant administrator, and we will get those questions answered for you. In the meantime, remember that a survey will pop up as you exit this session. So please answer those so that we can get topics to you that are going to be engaging and things that you need more or you have more questions about. So thank you everyone for attending today, and we will see you next week.